interest if I just replayed the video to you. It's almost exactly 15 minutes long, and I've got a few slides to add on to the end of that. But you know, let's have a discussion along the lines of, well, what did we know then compared with what we know now? I think there are certainly a few statements I made in the video that I wouldn't support now, but I also think that the video actually, you know, not my own interpretation of it, but the paper I was discussing contains quite a bit of insight. And this, by the way, will also serve as an introduction to Dr. Crystal Donnelly's talk, because it was, you know, her paper and the group of colleagues that I was talking about. So let me go into my own share screen, and I've got to adjust a couple of things. Murph, I'm going to both share computer sound and optimize screen sharing for video clip. I think those are the right way to do it. So can you all see that? Murph, can you see the web page now?
I can see the screen, your web page. Yeah, it's a little blurred.
It's a little blurred. Okay, that's a bit of concern. Let me at least do that. Well, this is my own website that I created as a website for the course. It's not the Sakai page, it's on my own home page. And this is the part I'm going to be discussing. So without further ado, I will just go into this. But Murph, if you can't both hear and see this clearly in the first 5
This is a remake of a video I first made.
Let me stop again. I was just starting it there. Did you hear those few words that I said there on the video?
Yes.
Okay, so I'm just going to let this run for 15 minutes, and then I'll come back and we'll do the rest of the meeting, okay?
2 days ago. The original version suffered from some sound quality issues, and I've also taken the opportunity to updating it by mentioning some recent commentaries. COVID-19 is affecting all of us. Here in North Carolina, the governor has issued orders closing public schools, restaurants, even some state parks. Some individual municipalities have gone beyond that and issued general stay-at-home orders. But some people are questioning why all these measures are necessary. I want to discuss those issues from the point of view of a paper that came out last week from Imperial College in England. The title of this paper reflects the distinction between pharmaceutical interventions, which would mean drugs and vaccines, which currently are not available for COVID-19, and non-pharmaceutical interventions, meaning things like social distancing, which is what we're talking about at the moment. I'll say more later about the authors of this paper, but they're from a well-known group that has worked on a number of previous studies of this nature. They divide, the Imperial College group divide the possible strategies into broadly 2 categories. Suppression means trying to reproduce, this is things like social distancing. The idea is to reduce the reproduction number, which is usually written as R. It refers to how many new cases on the average arise from each infected individual. Now, if R was below 1, the disease would quickly die out and we wouldn't have a problem. But for coronavirus, current estimates are that R lies between 2 and 2.6, and this explains the very rapid expansion of the disease that we've been observing. Now, the alternative measures, mitigation essentially means treating the people who are already sick, medical interventions, things like home isolation and maybe quarantines come under this heading. But the overall focus of the paper is that the overall argument of the paper is to say that mitigation on its own is not enough. We need suppression measures as well. I'll say a little bit about the methods behind this paper, not with the intention of going into fine detail, but I think to understand the results of the paper, you need to have at least a big picture view of how the results were generated. They use an individual-based simulation model. Now, another name for this sort of thing is agent-based models. It refers to having a large computer model in which the units of the simulation are hypothetical people, and the hypothetical people behave much like real people. They pass on an infection from one person to the next. Some of those people with the infection develop symptoms. Some of those with symptoms go on and die. And you follow these hypothetical people for a number of months, months to see how the epidemic grows and contracts. There are a number of assumptions of a medical nature. The incubation period, down here they're talking about things like the proportion of people who get infected to go on to develop symptoms. They allowed for an age stratification when they do this, and they also have some assumptions about this parameter that I just referred to as R. The types of intervention they're considering range from the mild to the restrictive. Mild restrictions mean things like isolating cases in the home, voluntary quarantines. They go on to talk about social distancing, either of the elderly population or of the whole population. And the last measure they consider here is closure of schools and universities. Now, at the time this paper came out, Britain had not yet taken the decision to close schools and universities, though subsequently they did take that decision. The first graphic here shows the projected number of deaths per 100,000 population. This is the unmitigated scenario. In other words, if we do nothing to try to control the disease. And in the British version of this plot, the number of deaths rises rapidly for a month or so, peaking sometime in late May, and then it would drop off, but at the cost of something like 500,000 deaths. The US version of the picture shows it developing more slowly, reflecting the fact that the US is a more spread out country, but still reaching a peak sometime in June, and overall about 2 million deaths. The bottom picture shows a version of that plot calculated separately for each of the 50 states. However, they don't label which state is which, so I can't tell you which one is North Carolina. The next picture is perhaps the most critical one of the whole paper. Now, they actually show two versions of this plot, one for Great Britain and one for the United States, but I'm showing the United States version here. What they're plotting is the number of critical care beds required per 100,000 unit of population. The black curve represents the do-nothing strategy we just talked about. The orange curve represents a strategy that's a combination of case isolation, household quarantine, and general social distancing. And the green curve takes all of those things and adds school and university closure. Now, when I gave a presentation about this to my class, one of the students said, well, didn't they consider any other strategies besides those? Did they consider different combinations of the different strategies? The answer is yes, they did. If you look at the paper, they give some quite detailed tables talking about all different kinds of strategies. But these are the three main ones that they focused on for this paper. And the horizontal red line represents the number of critical care beds available. So if the number required goes over the number available, then we're in trouble. And in particular for the unmitigated, the do-nothing strategy, the number of beds required will eventually exceed the number available by a ratio of something like 15-1, which would be pretty disastrous. So what the lower curve here, the lower plot is just a blow up of part of the top plot. But if we follow the orange curve here, that's the one that has case isolation, household quarantine, and social distancing, but not closing schools and universities. That shows that the thing remains controlled for a while, but under this projection, the demand for hospital beds would still exceed the supply sometime around July. Only the green curve that also includes school and university closures keeps things under control, at least for the period that the control measures overall are in existence. But the other message of this curve, of this plot, the plot assumes that we have these measures in place for 5 months, and what it shows is that once the measures are relaxed, even under the orange and green scenarios, the demand is going to go up and will again overwhelm the available supply. It will again overwhelm our hospital system. So they say, well, that's probably not good enough. We need to consider more complicated strategies. Now, this is an adaptive strategy. The figure shown here is just for Great Britain, but they imply that the curve for the United States is pretty similar. This strategy, it starts off by saying, well, assume about now we introduce controls, and they're plotting the number of weekly intensive care unit cases. It shows that that quickly comes under control and falls down again, and maybe sometime by July we'll decide, okay, we can now relax controls. But what will happen is that the number of cases will quickly bounce up again, and a few weeks later they'll have to reintroduce the controls. And under this scenario, we'll just have to continue that strategy, this sort of boom or bust cycle, until a vaccine is available. And they're speculating it would take as much as 18 months for a vaccine to be developed and then to be tested and then to be distributed to the whole population. I said I would say something about the authors. Obviously, I don't know all the names in that list, but two in particular jumped out at me. One is Neil Ferguson, the other's Crystal Donnelly, so let me tell you a bit more about them. Neil is British. He was originally a theoretical physicist, but then switched fields to mathematical biology. He moved to Imperial College about 20 years ago and has since risen to be a professor and the head of the group. Crystal is an American. I believe she was originally from Illinois. She did a PhD in biostatistics at Harvard. She then moved to the United Kingdom, and she also for the past 20 years has been at Imperial College. She once told me she sometimes comes to North Carolina to visit her mother, who lives in Greensboro, but that was a number of years ago, and I don't know whether her mother still lives in Greensboro. Together, the two of them have built up a very strong group with many successes in previous epidemics, and I personally think they're the best group in the world at doing this kind of analysis. There's an unfortunate coda to this story, which is that 2 days after the paper appeared, it was reported that Ferguson himself had come down with coronavirus and is currently in self-isolation in his apartment in London. Reports are that he's continuing to work, and of course we hope he will work out okay. Now, not everyone is convinced with this tale of woe. Perhaps the most prominent critic has been Bill Gates. In an interview published about a week ago, he was asked, what about this Imperial College study? Well, he says, in his opinion, the study was too pessimistic, that the projections in the study don't match what actually appeared in China, which may have some truth to it, but I will make the comment that the data from Imperial College, they didn't just take it from China, they also looked at other countries, most notably Italy, and of course where things stand at the moment is that deaths in Italy have actually exceeded those that originally took place in China. Other commentaries have criticised this. John Ioannidis is a professor at Stanford. He's well known in the scientific community for the papers he's written about what some people call the reproduction or the reproducibility crisis in science. His argument is not about reproducibility. He says we're making decisions without reliable data. He particularly focuses on the assumptions people are making about the death rate, and in his opinion, they're very ad hoc assumptions. But I think he's cherry-picking his data a little bit. He talks a lot about the cruise ship, the Diamond Princess, but nowhere in the paper does he refer to other countries, such as Italy or Spain, that have shown much higher death rates. Another critic from a different point of view has been David Katz in a commentary in the New York Times. He starts off his commentary by contrasting two types of military action, namely all-out war and surgical strikes. And he's saying what we really need for this disease is surgical strikes that are focused on protecting the most vulnerable parts of the population. He puts a lot of emphasis on immunity and makes the point that when people develop immunity, not only can they not get the disease themselves, but they also can't pass it on to others. So if enough people get immune, that way we will control the disease. This is also known as the herd immunity argument, and in fact that was British policy until Ferguson and colleagues produced their paper. So I think from the point of view of the Imperial College paper, what they're clearly arguing is that that would not be sufficient, because the point of school and university closings is not that school kids themselves are in great danger of getting the disease, but they will act as carriers throughout the community. And you'd prevent that by closing everything. So my take on all this is that I think Gates and Ioannidis, I mean, they're partly right. You've seen from the reason I showed you that slide about the methods was that it's clear there's some sort of arbitrariness about the precise numbers they use. And let's be fair, maybe they did slightly slant their analysis on the conservative side to present perhaps a more pessimistic picture than the truth. But I think that obscures a bigger point, which is that what really matters is the dynamics of the disease. In particular, think of that picture I showed with the boom and bust cycles. I'm fairly sure that you get the same type of picture. Even if you tweak the parameters a bit, you'd still get the same type of picture. The herd immunity argument has been advanced by other people apart from David Katz, but it seems a risky argument to me. We probably do need suppression as well as mitigation. But I do actually have one question my own for the Imperial College researchers. I was a little bit surprised that they never mentioned the testing issue. There's been a lot of discussion in the United States along the lines of if only we tested more people more quickly, as was done in South Korea, for instance, maybe we would have controlled this disease more quickly. So conclusions, my view is that the measures being undertaken in various states of America, including North Carolina, are almost certainly necessary, and indeed it's possible they're still not strong enough. On an individual level, we need to take this seriously, practice social distancing as much as we can, and please remember the purpose of social distancing is not just to protect you from getting the disease, but also to stop you passing it on to other people. Finally, if you have any questions or feedback, I'd be happy to respond. Please send me an email. Thank you.
Okay, well, let me stop there. That was what I said last March. I wanted to show you, so let me just comment on one thing right up front. I mean, this business about testing, I think it became clear in subsequent news stories. The Imperial College Group were definitely thinking about testing, but at that time they'd not yet brought it into their models. But maybe that will be a discussion with Crystal Donnelly when she gives her talk. Let me, before I open it up for questions from everybody else, let me, I've got a few additional slides of my own that I've put together just to describe some of the alternative modeling approaches. I want to say a bit about the SIR and SEIR models, which you may know a bit about by now. I want to say a bit about the UNC Duke and RTI project, which Kim Powers will talk about in a few weeks' time. I want to talk about another project that's taking place in India, and lastly, a few words. What has Bill Gates actually been doing with all this? Well, I will show you a bit about the model that came out of the group he's sponsoring. So this will just be very quick. This is just very much of a rundown. You can see more by following various links on the webpage. I noticed that Paul Delamater referred in the middle of his talk to the SEIR model. And the SEIR model is a model that looks like this. It's a model that imagines that you divide people into 4 groups. You have the susceptibles, people who've never got the disease. You have the exposed people who are exposed but haven't yet developed an infection. You have the people who have developed an infection, and you have people who've recovered. And recovered, I guess, the reason you don't also have deaths represented in this picture is that you can think of the deaths as being part of the recovered as far as considering the progress of the disease is concerned. But in this version, he also puts an arrow back to the susceptible group, which implies originally we didn't think this was the case, but that people who have recovered could possibly get the disease again. And sometimes this exposed box is left out because the exposed category refers to people who've been exposed to the virus but haven't yet developed symptoms. And I guess as of last March, it wasn't clear that this was necessarily an issue, but I think now we understand that it is an issue. So these are the kinds of models that are often used. A lot of the studies use these models one way or another. Now, the UNC Duke RTI model, which I assume Kim Powers will be talking about something much more up to date than this, but here's a report that I downloaded last April, and they were doing projections similar to what you just saw the Imperial College group doing for England and for the United States overall, namely to follow different projections. They were particularly focused on the issue of overwhelming the hospital system. So the probability of exceeding the capacity of acute treatment hospital beds. And you have two separate curves, one where you maintain restrictions and the other where you lift the restrictions. And you can see for yourself what the difference is between those two curves. Another model that a group of people did in India, this was led by somebody called Brahma Mukherjee, who is a professor of biostatistics at the University of Michigan, and she's from India originally, and she developed a model with a large group based at Michigan. And this was based on the SIR model without the E component. And they have developed a very comprehensive website projecting, again, this is as of May, this picture was showing, but showing how the disease would develop in India. And then lastly, this University of Washington model, the main point I wanted to make about this, please don't try to read all the text. I wasn't expecting people to read the whole text, but this is a completely different type of model. It's not an SIR model. It's essentially based on curve fitting, and the equation is actually meant to parameterize a particular type of curve where the disease first rises and then tails off. And it uses statistical ideas such as fixed and random effects modeling. So this is actually a much more statistical approach than the kind of approach being developed by Imperial College or as far as I believe, by the UNC Duke group. But there are some of the projections that they gave, and this is just downloaded as of 2 days ago. These are their current projections of, I guess this is total deaths through to December. So they're forecasting that it could still get as high as 350,000. So I think that was my last slide. Let me at this point stop, and I'll be happy to open it up for questions.
Thank you, Dr. Smith. Could we put our hands together again for him? Thank you for his talk.
Thank you.
And I believe I'm handing this over to group 4, but I want to encourage all of you, if you have a question, to definitely speak up and shout out, even if you're not in group 4.
Yeah, I have a question. Does the contact time influence the chance for an individual to become infected? Since in the report, I noticed that it says stopping mass gatherings is predicted to have relatively little impact because the contact time is at such events are relatively small.
I don't know that. So your question is, does it make a difference whether you're exposed to somebody for 15 seconds as opposed to half an hour? That's basically the question. That if
yeah, I think.
Yeah, I don't know the answer to that. There certainly were cases when this was first drawing attention back in February, March. There certainly were instances of two people maybe just passing each other in an airport lounge or something, and one of them getting infected from the other. So my understanding is that could be an issue, though I think the more detailed models that people have developed over the last several months have tended to build in contact time. But that might be a very good question for Dr. Donnelly or Dr. Powers. I don't really know the answer to myself.
Oh, thank you, thank you.
Good morning. This morning, I actually was beginning to read articles that the first cases of reinfection started to occur for people who've already passed through COVID and regained COVID again, in a sense. And if it was a new strain that had become available and whatnot. So my question is, if there is a new strain or the rate of reinfection occurs in a different rate compared to the initial reaction from COVID, how do you think this will affect predictive models in a statistical sense? How do you think this will affect statistical models that sort of leeway for the population in the sense of COVID?
That's another good question, and I don't know the answer. I mean, these reports that have come through, I think it was only within the last week that there have been a couple of cases where they found, now there's been this issue that people have been concerned about for some time, which is that people may get COVID and it just lingers on in the body for several months and then comes back and causes a reinfection that way. But I think what your question is about reinfecting with a different strand of COVID, and there have been reports in the last couple of weeks that people have been tested and they've been able to prove genetically that it's a different strain of COVID from the one that infected them in the first place. So it's definitely a new infection and not just a recurrence of the old infection. I'm not got expertise in that kind of topic. I think that is a concern as far as the statistical modeling is concerned. Well, you saw in that loop I showed you where the SEIRS model had the possibility that somebody who's got all the way through the chain can then loop back and become susceptible again. At the moment, I don't think we have enough data to estimate the rate at which that occurs. And of course, the other factor that this reinfection issue is very concerning about is what will it mean for the, and that's a whole unknown. I mean, the part of your question that could be addressed by changing the models a bit is the one about reinfection. That might be possible, but at the moment, I mean, the evidence is still that the reinfection rate is very small, and we don't know enough to say that it's different from
Thank
that.
you.
So that'll be my answer. Yeah.
Yeah, I actually had two questions. The first one I'm more interested in, because of the pandemic, I think it's very apparent, especially with pharmaceutical studies, that there is a balance of urgency over proper procedure. So there have been studies on possible cures that have been rushed for the purpose of getting this out faster. So I was curious about your personal opinion. Should the studies continue with the complete procedure, or should there still be an urgency component to it for trying to hurry the study along at the price of maybe reliability?
Yeah, okay. Did you say there was a second question, or was that both questions?
Oh yeah, and the second one was I had a similar one to the Hari's question about mutability, the fact that there were signs of several strains, but it's possible that more just can naturally happen, and that can affect the spread both positively and negatively. And I was interested if that can be accounted for somehow in the models.
Well, I think I'd have to give the same answer to the second question. I think I'd have to give the same answer to Harry, that yes, I think it should be possible to change the models to account for these factors. I'm not sure we have enough data at the moment to be sure about it. Now, your first question, I think, is a very interesting one. I mean, just to give a bit of background, some of the things I've done in the past, I've worked closely with epidemiologists, but not on infectious diseases. My own main epidemiology field of interest is about health effects of air pollution, which is not an infectious disease, so some of these infection issues don't arise at all. But the air pollution literature has definitely suffered from people publishing studies where the data are not properly documented. Sometimes the statistical methods are not properly documented. And this can sometimes lead to what, in my opinion, is quite unnecessary controversy about some of the studies. And I think we've seen this a bit now with now you could say with air pollution, there's no particular urgency about it, no need to find a very quick cure. But I mean, the study that came out earlier in the year, there were two studies that came out. One was in the Lancet, the British journal, and the other was, I think it was the New England Journal of Medicine. It was either New England Journal or JAMA, one or the other. In other words, two of the most prestigious journals in the world for medical research published papers where the data had not been verified, and they were forced to retract the studies after various researchers queried the credibility of the numbers that came out. So, on this balance of urgency versus procedure, my own take would be that we need to be following appropriate procedures, and particularly when it comes to testing a vaccine, I think hopefully they can accelerate the process by recruiting subjects quickly, but I don't think they should promote a vaccine without it being properly and thoroughly tested. By the way, if anyone else wants to chip in and make your comments about what I'm saying, I mean, please do so. There should be an open-ended discussion.
Hey, Professor Smith, your presentation was very instructive. Okay. I have a question about SER. I have questions about SER model. And my question is that how to ensure the accuracy of the exposed number of people when the asymptomatic infected person appears, because it's very important to ensure the exposed number in this model. So how to ensure that?
So I think, let me just go back to my, let me see, I need to share my screen again if I want to show you something, because I'm not sharing it at the moment. Just a moment. Let me just go back a second. So there we are. So I was showing, I was going to go back. Can you see my screen now? So if we go back to that model. Sure. So your question was, how do we ensure the accuracy of the number? So, so one comment I would make is, I mean, there are these things there that are represented by Greek symbols, right? Beta, sigma, gamma, and psi. They're all, I guess there's a convention in statistics that if we have unknown quantities, we represent them by Greek letters to distinguish them from Roman letters would be for things we can definitely measure. So these quantities, beta, sigma, gamma, and psi, they represent, they are quantities that are estimated. And, down here, the infectious rate, beta, controls the rate of spread, which represents the probability of transmitting disease between a susceptible and an infectious individual. So these are estimates. Basically, it comes down to, if you're somebody who is susceptible, what's the probability that, or if you switch from, say, from being susceptible to being exposed. So what's the probability, if you're susceptible today, what's the probability you're going to be exposed tomorrow? That depends on some things that are specific to you, namely, whether you go to a restaurant for dinner tonight or something like that. But but you can also measure these things on a population basis. And the criticisms that Bill Gates and Ioannidis were making in that video I showed you, the criticism they were making was that we don't really have enough data to estimate these quantities. Now, just to go forward a bit, this model that the Indian people produced was actually what they were trying to do was to come up with some new ways of addressing that question. And this model was a bit later than the Imperial College paper. So they did come up with better methods of estimating those quantities. But it's still the case that how accurately you can estimate them depends on the quality of the data you've got. Let me go out of share screen. How well you can estimate those quantities depends on the quality of the data you've got. And I think that's still one of the biggest problems with this whole method of modeling. I mean, I'm not trying to say that you shouldn't do this kind of modeling. I think people should do this kind of modeling, but it's a case of understanding and being realistic about what you can't measure. So in the end, yeah, I agree with your point. I mean, not knowing the exact number exposed really is a critical issue.
I have a question somewhat related to the SEIR model.
Yep.
So with things like legislation changes like the stay-at-home order or mask orders, or even like population density, how do you account for those variables when creating a model?
So that's a very important point, because the whole reason that the Imperial College group and some of the other groups, including the UNCG group, they all came out with different curves represent, they say if you do one set of measures, it goes this way, and if you do another set of measures, it goes that way. They all came out with results of that nature. And the point is that these estimates of the infection rate and the other unknown parameters of the model, they depend on the kind of policies that are adopted. So, for instance, when the Imperial College group basically said social distancing isn't enough, you also need to close the schools and universities. This, remember, was back in March. Well, they did the analysis both ways. First, they did the analysis without any restrictions, and then they did it with restrictions that correspond to social distancing, but without closing schools and universities. And then they did it a third way, where they did include closing schools and universities. And as I mentioned during the talk that I recorded, the one I played to you, that in the paper, they actually did consider a number of other policies besides those. So where this all plays into is how people estimate those infection rates. And particularly the idea is that if you impose social distancing, that would significantly reduce the probability that one person transmits the disease to another. So I mean, that's where those measures come into the models, that we have these models with these infection rates and transmission rates and recovery rates. Well, social distancing isn't going to affect the recovery rate especially, but it does affect the rate at which infected people pass on the disease to others. And that's the really critical point of the whole study.
Thank you.
So does anyone have any thoughts you'd like to try and build a model like this? I mean, I've shown you there are these research groups doing this SIR model. Have you thought what it would take to actually write a computer program to do a model like that? I mean, it's a sort of a fun thing you might try to imagine, that you'd write a program. I mean, you have to imagine that you make some assumptions about the number of people infected, exposed, and so on. But could you imagine writing a computer program that would simulate these quantities and would allow you to test out different values for these transmission rates? That might be a fun thing to do. And there's plenty of literature. I think if you go to, I mean, you can start with my own webpage, but Murph actually pointed out to me that Paul Delamater, who gave the talk last week, if you go to his webpage, he has a number of links embedded within that webpage. And that picture I showed you with the 4 boxes for the SEIR model, that was taken from something that was on his webpage. But if you look at the webpage, he actually talks a lot more about how he estimated those numbers for North Carolina and how we use them to create the projections. So, you know, while it might seem daunting to go out and get all the data and do these complicated models, the basic concepts at the heart of it aren't all that complicated.
Yeah, I can think of an implication using random numbers and testing for just choosing a spread chance and then using a random number and selecting one with the same probability that would be the spread. But I just thought that it might actually be difficult to implement particular spread rates. I just remembered a certain thing with Russia's cases, for instance. When the quarantine was issued, they did it in a way where it wasn't exactly a stay-at-home order, it was a don't go to work order. So what ended up happening was all of the people went to resorts and having barbecues. And I think it actually made the overall cases worse than it was, because if people were naturally tempted to stay at home, they got official holidays, so they all got out. And yeah, I was curious about how can you predict these kinds of implications on spread rates, because in this case you'd think the quarantine should have hindered the spread, but it actually aided it, in fact.
Well, that raises another interesting question, which is that we've talked about these models as if these are all inanimate objects, but of course they're not inanimate objects, and people are not inanimate objects, and how well people comply with the rules is itself an unknown. And I didn't know about the case of Russia that you just referred to, but I mean, I think what we've seen in Chapel Hill is that how and around the United States generally is that how much people are willing to comply with the rules that are imposed is itself something that is reflected in the transmission rate. But where that all comes to is that the estimates of transmission rates, I mean, yes, basically they're assuming that whatever rules are imposed are actually going to be obeyed, and that is at best a crude approximation.
Professor, related to people not abiding by some of the lockdown procedures, I am wondering if in the SEIR model you get nonlinearity, so that when many people start increasing their activity, the increase in spread is sort of drastic past a certain point versus sort of contained within maybe are there nonlinear points or things like that?
Oh, it's absolutely a nonlinear model. I mean, this is what I didn't say about SIR models is that while it may seem something relatively new for COVID, I mean, people have been using models like this for other infectious diseases for decades. And the classical example is measles. And measles tend to follow a 2-year cycle, because what happens is that in the first year you get a lot of people infected, and as a result there are fewer susceptibles the second year. So the second year you get much of a less sharp epidemic, but then by that time people have recovered from the previous bout of measles, so it all starts again in the third year. So it's a classical example of chaotic dynamics, and lots of papers have been written about that aspect of it. So yes, your question about so what that means in plain English terms, and I should have actually mentioned this in connection with those sometimes those figures have been criticized, like 2 million deaths in the US. Well, people say, well, obviously that was totally fictitious. You couldn't imagine actually getting that number of deaths. Well, you run one of these models, and I haven't seen anybody actually do this, but I would bet if you started if you just ran one of these models, put the same parameters into it, but just ran the models 10 times over in succession, you'd get very different numbers for the final numbers of infected people, because there is this chaotic nonlinearity to the way an epidemic grows. And so there's some inherent unpredictability about it, apart from the difficulty of actually estimating these parameters and whether people will comply with social distancing and so on. There's also the fact that the model itself is unstable. And I think that's something that hasn't been fully recognized in some of the discussion that's been going on. I think we've got time for a couple more questions. If anybody, I guess we should be finishing at 10:10, should we? Murphy, you're the one controlling this, so I guess we've got about 3 minutes left. Anyone?
Professor Smith, good morning.
Go ahead.
I do have a question in regards to the point made during your video about symptomatic individuals being thought to be a good bit more infectious, because there's this whole concern and focus around the silent carriers or the asymptomatic individuals. Right. And why would it be thought that those who are symptomatic are more contagious than those who aren't? Perhaps because of their airborne, issues, or
I
just
actually
like your thoughts on
thought it was
that.
the other way round. I may have got this wrong, but I thought the reason for making the distinction is that once people show symptoms, then they're isolated. I mean, I think everywhere there's been some sort of strategy of isolating people who show symptoms, but the problem, and that's the reason for the E part in the SEIR model, that there's this phase there's this period believed to be about a week where somebody has been exposed and is able to pass it on to other people, but they're not showing symptoms and therefore they're not isolated, and that the spread of the disease has been much worse because of that. Now, I don't know to what extent, perhaps this would be a good question for Crystal Donnelly, I don't know to what extent they actually allowed for that and built it into their model, but I would, as of last March, but it seems to me it's quite a critical issue now.
Thank you.
I actually wanted to add to that because I've looked at the transmission thing from a biological perspective, and I would suspect that asymptomatic people spread it better than symptomatic, because the biological response with the generating phlegm actually hinders the spread, and it makes it difficult to travel longer distances, because it seems like the spread goes easier through fine aerosol in enclosed spaces with air circulation, like air conditioning. So it might be that when people are symptomatic and are coughing, they're making it harder to pulverize the virus particles into the air to make them travel further. So that might be a factor as well.
So you're saying there's actually a natural tailing off of the infectious probability, that the people in the early stages of infection are more infectious than the ones who fully developed symptoms. That might be true. I didn't know that, but thank you for pointing that out.
Okay, so I think we've reached the end of our time. If we could put our emoji hands together and thank Dr. Smith. And of course, if you have any additional questions, his email. You offered your email in your video. I hope you still offer your email to us to ask additional questions.
Sure, yeah. If anyone wants to ask me questions, go ahead, yes.
I'm also going to post this video, and look out. I had some announcements at the beginning of class. If you missed them, I'm also going to post them on Sakai. So thank you, everyone.
All right, thank you.